Welcome to At the Table with Tom and Eric, a show about the people who play board games. I'm Eric Summerer, and our guest at the table today is the designer of Last Light, upcoming from Gray Fox Games. He's also the host of the Epic Gaming Night podcast that has come in and out and had multiple lives. And
We've been reborn.
We're going to talk about that. And he is also, now I want to get your official title, but in my mind, you are chief editor and technical director at the Dice Tower. Is that accurate?
I guess it's along the lines of like production manager and stuff like that. But yes.
I don't know if you have like specific business cards that say this is what you're doing.
I edit a ton of reviews and I run like basically all of the live streams.
Anything that requires pushing technical buttons, Roy Cannaday is your guy.
Right.
Roy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you, but we should probably address the elephant who's not in the room.
Oh, yes.
The name of the show is At the Table with Tom and Eric. Tom, so the idea that we were planning to do, we're at Dice Tower West. Mm-hmm. We were going to literally be at a table. Right. And set up at a table and see.
It would be very thematic.
It would. It was going to work perfectly, except a little bit of a monkey wrench came into play, and Tom lost his voice on day 2 here at the convention. So it's just me.
It's been an interesting experience being like, Tom runs things, lots of events.
Yes.
So we've all been like, hey, you've kind of been doing even more talking than normal.
It is interesting when we're sort of used to. All right, Tom, what do you want to do for this? How do you want to handle this? And he's not always able to answer that question, and that's been interesting. But I am, that aside, very excited to get to chat with you because you are in the middle of what proves to be an interesting year. I think you've got a lot of exciting stuff coming up.
Yeah, it's been a crazy year so far, but there's been a lot of things leading up to this year. But then it's just started off kind of crazy with the cruise and everything.
Oh, sure.
Been a bang.
I mean, so you were about to have your first major game release.
Yes.
Your first design. Is it going to be this year or is it going to be early next year?
It's definitely going to be this year because everything's in manufacturing currently. We have all the stuff being made in China currently. I know they've done a lot of the plastic work and stuff like that. They're putting all the paper stuff together. We're finalizing the rule book, like just the last final touches on everything, and it's being manufactured now. And then it's going to be coming over in May on the boats, and then it's going to be shipped out to everybody from there. So, of course, God willing with delays and things like that, but it will be coming to people this summer. And Gen Con.
Yes, so you're about to hit your first Gen Con as a designer instead of just as an attendee or as a Dice Tower personality. I want to get to that soon, but let's back up just a little bit first and get our basic biographical data.
Gotcha.
You obviously live in Florida now.
Right, Homestead, Florida with all the rest of the Dice
Tower
Tower
You're at Dice Tower headquarters, but where'd you grow up?
I was born in Georgia, and when I was like around 5, I moved to North Carolina. Well, actually moved to Virginia because I had my grandparents lived there, and that's where my dad was from. And I lived in Virginia until probably like the age of like 16 or something like that.
Okay.
Played lots of games with my dad. My dad was he was into war games and like role-playing games and stuff like that. So I ended up playing a lot of games with my dad growing up as well. So I kind of have like this history of playing games growing up. And then when I was in my late teens or whatever, we moved to North Carolina, and I lived there for quite a while.
So is that like your earliest, what would be the earliest memory you have of playing games?
I know I remember playing like Stratego and Monopoly and things like that, like little kid versions of that, like in my old house and stuff like that. And my dad had like shelves and shelves of like Circus Maximus and Dune and like all of these games and lots and lots of war games, that he had for like a long time that I didn't necessarily play all of them until I played some stuff later, but I never really got into the wargaming side of it, just more like the fun stuff. We had like the War of the Ring TSR edition and stuff like that. Actually, I remember playing that like when I was still quite like not really young, but probably like 10 or something like that. We played like the paper map War of the Ring.
Wow.
And like moving the chits around and stuff like that. And we played it a couple times because there's 2 different versions. We played as just characters, and then as like actual army troops on the map, moving full armies and stuff like that. So,
do you remember ever looking at the stuff on the shelf and saying, can I play this, and not being ready, quote unquote ready yet?
Yeah, I really think he kind of like met us where we were. He kind of like knew, I guess, what we were into. I played a lot of Gamma World as well, which is like post-apocalyptic role-playing.
Yeah.
And we started that when we were probably around the same age, around like 10, 11, something like that. And it was basically because D&D was a little bit of a faux pas in our like church community or whatever.
Okay.
My dad was like, okay, we're gonna play Gamma World and have the kids come over and play Gamma World, and that'll kind of be like the thing, because it was basically the same thing, but mutants and crazy powers and technology. And I grew up playing that for like the longest time, and we played the same characters from when we were like 10 till when we were like 18. So
whoa.
So we played for like, and he'd have a lot of like church friends and like homeschool friends come over, and we'd play the same role-playing game sessions back to back to back to back. Just like every once in a while, we'd have birthday parties and come over and play role-playing games. It was kind of fun. So
wow. So same character. How far did you advance those characters?
it would be funny. You would think you would advance them. We didn't ever really level up our characters. We just always used the same characters. We had like the same items and stuff like that, but we'd just go through different stories and just make up stuff. I mean, he went through modules that he had, but of course, with any DM thing, he's gonna adjust it and change it around and stuff like that.
Right.
I remember we went through, like, we started in this like small hobble village in this post-apocalyptic town that only had like spears and daggers and stuff, and ended up going to like a chicken factory and getting laser pistols and rifles. We went on our rite of passage as teenagers. It's kind of funny because our characters kind of grew with us as we went along, you know.
Huh. So I mean, rather than leveling up in game terms, you leveled up in maturity of your characters.
Yeah.
That's cool. It's an interesting approach, and neat that you were able to keep those characters throughout.
And we occasionally would play one-shots when like different people would come in, you know, with different characters and stuff like that, but we would always go back to like those same original characters we had.
Huh. And how'd you handle people dropping in and out? You said, you know, it's different groups of kids, so did you have people...
Most of the time we would only play the main campaign if it was the actual like core group, and sometimes we had some kids that would just like we'd have like groups of brothers and stuff like that. That's like, oh well, the youngest brother decided they didn't want to play anymore. They wanted to go play video games instead of playing a role-playing game. So then my dad would just kind of like run them as an NPC for a little while. Maybe they'd stay out of town that we walked through, you know, that sort of stuff.
Cool. So at what point was this not just something you did with Dad, but your own hobby, that you took it on as your own thing to do?
As far like I started doing CCGs before that. There was this, I really wanted to play Overpower when it came out.
Okay.
And I had seen other CCGs and stuff like that, but my parents didn't really know what Overpower was or where to get or anything like that. So they got me into the Redemption collectible card game, which is like a Christian collectible card game that came out in like 1997 or something like that.
Okay.
And I played that hardcore. Like it took us a while to learn the rules, but once we figured it out, my dad helped us figure out the rules. Me and the other boys kind of like in our little group that we played role-playing games with started playing the game and getting more cards, and my parents, we'd go to the Christian bookstore, and every time my parents would like buy us a new booster pack, and we started building these decks with all these different biblical characters. My dad started running tournaments for it, and we'd go to tournaments, and I ended up taking that all the way to the fact of like I was winning like all these state and regional tournaments, and like I made it one time where I basically had won every style of tournament. I had won like 2 state tournaments, even though for points you can only really win 1. And then I went all the way to the national tournament, and even the designer of the game came up to me and was like, hey, you know, if you win the national tournament, you'll have the perfect record score, and no one's ever done that before. And I got second. So I went through the entire tournament undefeated, and then we had a pairing where someone had already lost and I had already won, like I had won everything. And he beat me, but because of the tiebreaker rules, he ended up winning the whole tournament. So, you know, gotta stay humble.
Sure. So close to victory. I had no idea there was such an infrastructure to this game.
There isn't really anymore, but back in, I guess, like the early 2000s or whatever, is when there was a lot of, like, they would have it. It was mostly, like, at churches and stuff like that you could go to and play Redemption, and they'd run a ton of different tournaments and stuff like that there.
And almost as an alternative to, say, Magic the Gathering.
Right. It was
don't play that game,
that's
play this
basically
game instead.
Exactly what it was treated as. It's like, you're not allowed to touch Magic. This is the Christian Magic. It's basically exactly how it was played. I went on later in life to play Magic, actually, and had fun with that, but never had as much success because there's a lot more competition there. I'm sure. So.
What other CCGs did you pick up?
My parents let me play Pokemon for some reason. Okay. So I played a bunch of Pokemon when that came out, and when that was kind of a craze. And when was it, like the late 90s or something like that, or early 2000s?
Heading into 2000 is
right. So that was kind of a craze. I would always get the stuff and build decks with my Pokemon cards and be like, let's play Pokemon. And all the other kids like in the neighborhood would be like, play Pokemon? Yeah. What are you talking about? Why would you play the game? We're just collecting the cards.
My kids find the same thing. You know, their friends love playing or collecting the cards, and they trade them that way with no gameplay
I would always
consideration at all.
trade away my holographic cards for cards that were actually good in
Good in the
gameplay.
game.
I'd be like, I'll trade you my holographic one for a version of the same thing and this other card that's actually good to play with, you know, because I had already played a bunch of Redemption and already
Sure.
played RPGs and other random board games like War of the Rings. So I was like, I want to play games, you know. So
Did you ever do any of the organized play for Pokemon?
I know, not really. I know we went to like Books A Million one time and did something event that they had there, but not really like tournaments and stuff like that. So
Cool.
my parents were willing to go to like the Redemption stuff, but not necessarily the Pokemon stuff as much. So, but we played the Game Boy game and all of that stuff also. So
Okay. And so where were you, like, schooling-wise when Pokemon was out? How old were you?
I don't know, probably like early teens or something. I thought. So I
Okay.
don't
I'm
know,
just trying to
or
figure out where we are
mid-teens.
in that timeline.
It's so hazy these years. The older you get, the longer it's like, when did this stuff
It's all
happen?
just
It all
a blur.
jumbles together.
Yes. Okay. So when did the design bug start to hit?
I remember, like, my earliest memories are because I was playing, like, NES games and playing Gamma World with my dad. I remember playing a game with little Z-Bot robots where I was trying to, like, make a game where you'd use a ruler and move these Z-Bots, and they all had different stats, kind of like you'd have stats that would let you move and different things like that. I never actually, like, made anything of that, but I remember, like, writing down little charts and sheets and things. And me and one of my friends I played Gamma World with were like, man, it'd be really cool if this Gamma World game had a fantasy version, you know? If there was Gamma World,
Right,
but
okay.
it was fantasy like Lord of the Rings, because we love Lord of the Rings, we watched the cartoons, we read the books. So we're like, if we could have dwarves and elves and like giants and fairies in a role-playing game setting, that would be amazing. So we were like,
Wouldn't that be Dungeons and Dragons, though?
exactly. We were reverse engineering Dungeons
Yes.
and Dragons from this Gamma World game that my
Okay.
dad was actually allowing us to play, but we weren't allowed to play Dungeons and Dragons because of the faux pas of playing
It's
Dungeons
so
and Dragons
funny
in the
that
church.
it was really just the name that
Right.
was, that's what was
Right.
bad.
So I remember very distinctly with like one of my friends like writing down, being like, okay, the dagger will be the D4 damage, and then a sword would be a D6, and it was basically reverse engineering D&D, and we'd actually like made up some like stats for like the giant will get plus this to that, and we played a lot of like role-playing game video games and stuff like that too. So like Dragon Warrior and things like that. So we were familiar with stats and all that stuff and playing Gamma World. So we were kind of like doing stuff, and we would like battle with our little made-up fantasy characters, like rolling dice, and we were just kids. It wasn't like solid or anything.
Yeah.
But I remember trying to basically make a fantasy version of Gamma World, not actually knowing what D&D was.
That's funny. So then when you did finally get some D&D materials in front of you, did you find that you had made some of the same decisions regarding certain characters or mechanisms? Or
I
anything
very
like that?
distinctly remember like the fact that like how damage works as far as like rolling just like the different polyhedrals for each type of weapon is very similar to D&D, because I mean like a dagger is normally like a D4 and a
Sure.
sword is like a D6, and you go up from there. It's like, oh, a morning star is this. You know, we were making up all sorts of different stuff, you know, because we had played a lot of other games that were inspired from D&D, but it was just kind of funny that we didn't actually play the actual version of D&D. I didn't end up playing D&D until I was past 18, you know, so it's kind of crazy.
Okay. So you're sort of known for really enjoying space games,
Yes.
but you haven't mentioned any space games yet. I guess Gamma World, maybe?
Yeah, it's very sci-fi. I guess I really got more into space even later on in life. I was always into like science and stuff growing up.
Yeah.
I had like a little microscope as a kid, running around and doing all that stuff. I was always very interested in it. I wonder what space games I played the most. I know I played Masters of Orion and things like that. Starting playing those video games is probably what
Okay.
got me more into like the space theme.
Yep.
And really just playing other 4X style games got me super pumped. I played a ton of Race for the Galaxy and stuff. Once I started really getting into,
Okay.
like way older, once I started getting into board games, and being like, man, I just really enjoy space style stuff. And just the thought of traveling out, you know. I watched Star Trek Next Generation and things like that. you
Shit,
know.
okay,
So
yeah.
Star Wars was always a fan favorite, you know. We always liked all of that stuff. So it's like, space, yeah.
Cool. What is it about the genre that speaks to you?
I don't know, just the fact of exploration past, you know, what we currently have here on the planet, you know,
Yeah.
and then just I started watching more and more YouTube videos about astrophysics and like a bunch of different stuff, just trying to self-educate myself. I was homeschooled, so I have like kind of like an interesting history with education. So a lot of stuff I feel like I had to self-educate myself on in a lot of
Okay.
ways. So like I continued to learn even once I started working and things like that, just watching tons of different YouTube videos and things like that. I would fall asleep each night listening to Isaac Arthur videos where he has kind of like astrophysics theory and stuff like that. And he talks
Whoa.
about like, oh, what if these aliens came or those things? A lot of like, I guess science fantasy, but trying to make it more like science fiction, like trying to be like these fantasy thoughts of things, how could they actually happen in the real world? So it's just kind of interesting stuff. So I'd fall asleep a lot of nights listening to that stuff, and listening to him talk about like the heat death of the universe and watching other videos about the heat death of the universe made me decide to like make a game in that setting. So
Interesting. Was that ever a career focus for you to go into astrophysics? Or any of that
I'm
stuff?
not nearly good enough at math to do that. It's more of just like a hobby sort of thing and just enjoying that stuff. That just needs way more calculation than I think.
Yeah, it's like in theory, it's
like
really
I
cool.
like learning about it.
Yeah.
Doing it would be a completely different thing.
And then making a game about it.
Right, yeah.
All right, so there's our transition to Last Light. How long has this been in the works?
I know I started working on it kind of in the spring of 2017. I talked about doing some stuff. I had a bunch of other random games and stuff that I designed. I had done Magic, and after getting out of Magic, I really got into board games like hardcore just because it was way more accessible and you could play with more people. And I tried to design some games here and there. And some of the stuff I had like a little card game that was post-apocalyptic, kind of like Gamma World-ish themed that I showed to Clever Mojo forever ago. Like this is like, we're talking a decade ago.
Yeah.
And they kind of like, oh, this has player elimination and this and that. We don't want that because I was brand new to board games. I didn't understand that stuff.
Yeah.
And then I had designed a fantasy 4X game forever ago. And I had been like, man, I really like this. And I was a huge fan of the Plaid Hat podcast. And I actually ended up taking that and kind of re-theming it into like a Summoner Wars theme and send it to Plaid Hat forever ago.
Okay.
And they sent that back to me being like, oh, this is not quite ready. It's not quite unique enough and this and that. And I was just dipping my toes in game design. And then I kind of put the game design stuff away for a while and started doing more board game media stuff. I started like trying to make my own reviews and things like that, and started up bringing friends over to play games, and we started up the Epic Gaming Night podcast, and that led into doing a ton of board game media stuff. And then eventually I started picking up the design stuff again after I had learned a lot more about board games and the board game industry and kind of how mechanics work and how things work together, because I felt like I had the creativity spark, but not the knowledge of how to put together something solid.
Right. So you think you've learned a lot about the nuts and bolts of putting a game together because you've been criticizing them for the last several years?
Right, yeah. And I also just consuming tons of board game media. Like I listened to all of Tom's the Board Game University series where tons of designers talk through stuff. I started watching tons of videos on game design and things like that, just trying to consume and become like a student of the industry basically, and getting in a bunch of things of like just learning about how people do stuff in the industry and how to make a game fun and how to make a game work, and just seeing other people's designs, like this works, that works, this is what people like, this is what people don't like, and finding a style that meets my taste. So in 2017 I started making the space game because I loved Eclipse, I loved Twilight Imperium, I loved Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea, I loved all these games, but they were super long, It's like, holy smokes, I want to play these with my friends, but I can't even play them with my friends as much as I want to because they take so long to play. I have to set up an entire game day, and then there's family strains of setting up an entire game day to play a single game,
Right.
So I try to take those concepts and take some concepts from other games of how to like minimize downtime and keep the game really snappy,
Right.
and put that into my design for Last Light. When I first set it up, I was thinking like, oh, I want like a space game where I can take over areas and control them and get points by playing a card and get points by doing it that way. But I was like, it's not unique enough, I need something to make it more unique. And that's when I kind of came up with the idea of having this rotating board that would mimic a star system. And I'm like, that's worth actually working on, that's worth actually doing. So then I put a lot of it together and just tried to hone things and make things the way I wanted. And then basically I took it, I got it together, I played it, I basically from the spring, basically in like April to August, I didn't really play it with anybody. And the beginning of August, I started actually playing it with friends, and I tweaked a couple things there, and I actually took it to Gen Con that August just for fun, and I played it with some random people outside of the hot games room that BGG sets up, and they actually really enjoyed the game. And I'm like, holy smokes! They're like, this is cool. I mean, this and that, maybe this and this, and giving me a couple of ideas on stuff. But they really liked the idea of the rotating board, and I had made all these 3D planets out of clay that I had baked in the oven and had on stands, just because like I wanted the aesthetics of the game to be really cool. And then at the end of that Gen Con, I was really good friends with the Plaid Hat crew because I had tried to pitch a game to them, and then I also had interacted with their podcast a ton, and they had been on my podcast because I'd been doing Epic Gaming Night for quite a while at this point. I went to their game night or their prototyping night or whatever, and just played it with a couple of their people there, and they're like, "This is amazing." And this is after I had play tested it just a little bit with friends, And they're like, "This just works. There's a couple things here and there that maybe tighten up, but you need to pitch this to us." So that made me be like, "Holy smokes! Well, I definitely need to work on this." So I worked on it a lot more, brought it back to them at Origins and pitched it to Isaac, and he's like, "We definitely want to do the game, because we were talking back and forth the whole time in between that. They're like, "We definitely want to do the game. We need you to pitch it to Colby now at PAX Unplugged."
Yep.
So, and this was before I started working for the Dice Tower at all. Before I was pitching it to Colby, right before that, right around that PAX Unplugged time, I knew that I was going to be starting working for the Dice Tower. I had interviewed with Tom, and I was going to be a part of the Dice Tower. And then from there, I basically pitched it to Colby, and he was like, "This is the best pitch I've ever got for a game. Let's play it." I played it with Emerson and Colby and Jerry at that point, and they really enjoyed the game and ended up taking it, and they had it for a little while. And the following Gen Con after that, they told me that they wanted me to pitch it to Fantasy Flight. Because they wanted to have the game, but they wanted to put Fantasy Flight's name on the game.
Right, and this is when Plaid Hat was part of Asmodee.
This is when Plaid Hat was part of Asmodee. So they were like, "We've done a ton of sci-fi games, but we feel like Fantasy Flight's sci-fi games are stronger than ours as far as selling it," because they had done things like Starship Samurai and things like that, which I love those games, but they said it hadn't gotten as big of a boost as they wished, and they were like, "This could be like a Cosmic Encounter or a Twilight Imperium 4X game, and it would be great if it was in that." I pitched it to Andrew Navarro with Colby because I was like, "Colby, if you're going to pitch my game, you better do it right." And he's like, "Do you want to come?" I'm like, "Yes, I will totally come and help you pitch my game." So then instead of Colby pitching it, it was me pitching it to Fantasy Flight, which is kind of strange. But Colby's slant was, "We want you to put your name on the box, and we're still going to develop it." And it was just kind of interesting because as soon as I pitched it to Fantasy Flight, they're like, no, you don't need to develop it. We're going to take the whole thing. We want to do it ourselves. We're going to do this in Twilight Imperium. We're going to make this crazy, And I mean, I was super excited at the time. I was like, "What in the world?" I was literally, after coming out of that meeting, I was crying because at the time, Twilight Imperium was my favorite game of all time. Sure. And the fact that Fantasy Flight said that they were going to make my game in that IP.
In that universe,
was blowing my mind, So, and it was super amazing. And then Asmodee's production team saw all these 3D planets and this rotating board. Basically, they had it for 3 months, maybe 4 months, something like that. I'm going back and forth with it. They saw the 3D planets, the rotating board, and the production team. And this is when they were laying off a ton of different other parts of Fantasy Flight. Yeah. And they said, "We're not going to take on this project." And they basically gave it back to me.
Wow.
And I reached back out to Colby at that time because I was like, "Colby, they gave it back to me, and you wanted to make it, but they took it away from you." And he's like, "Well, I can't really do anything because I'm under Asmodee," and he had his own things that was going on at the time.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, they gave it back to me. And then the next PAX Unplugged, I haven't really changed much in the game over all this time.
Yeah.
The next PAX Unplugged, I ended up pitching it to publishers again, and this was while I was already deep in the Dice Tower at that point. I'd been there for basically a year. And Tom was like, "Well, we'll figure out something." But I mean, I talked to several publishers about showing it to them. I showed it to Gameling Games, I showed it to Arcane Wonders, and I showed it to Grey Fox. And basically all of them were very interested in the game, and I think Arcane Wonders and Grey Fox wanted to publish the game.
Nice.
I ended up talking to several different people, and I ended up going with Grey Fox Games just because they wanted to make the game the way it looked. They're like, "We want the 3D planets, we want the rotating board, we want the crazy aliens." They shared my vision for the game.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of where we were. Then it's kind of like, okay, they have a pipeline of games coming out, so they're working on those games first. Then they start working on Last Light, and the whole time COVID started happening, I started demoing it online like crazy. I put my own copy on Tabletop Simulator and started demoing it for tons and tons of people. And I tried to get the word out as much as I could after the game was announced. And I just demoed with people, played with more people. And honestly, all this time, I haven't really changed any major mechanics of the game. I've tweaked maybe, okay, this costs a common resource, maybe it should cost a rarer resource now, Nothing major has really changed in the game since way back in the day. So it's kind of like I've had this game waiting to come out for years,
Yeah.
And hopefully this year it's coming out this summer. So It's been a long process.
Was there a point, I mean, you said you were excited when Fantasy Flight was going to take it, but they were saying they were going to do stuff to it. Was there a point that you said, but that's my baby, I don't
Here's
want
the
you
thing,
to do stuff to it?
they very much were like, okay, well, maybe we can make this game if we make the plants discs. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fine. They're like, well, we'll make it with the Twilight Imperium aliens. I'm like, that's amazing. For me, the trade-off for it being in that IP was worth it for me, because they were still going to keep the mechanics the same. And that's what I was very excited about, is they really liked the way the game played. They liked how fast it was. They loved like a lot of the aspects of it. But I think just like the production and the timing was terrible. I actually was talking to John D. Clare, who's here, who said he had a game with Fantasy Flight almost the exact same time that they gave back to him as well, basically just because they weren't picking up projects at that time. And Fantasy Flight has always very much been internal designers instead of external designers.
Sure,
So
yeah.
even getting your foot in the door is a little bit hard. So
Yeah. It's got to be a weird, you know, you said you've been working on this for a while, and you sort of hand things off to publishers and you have to wait. Sometimes, like you said, for a year, and you don't know what the status of the project is.
I think the audience out there doesn't realize how long games not even are necessarily in development, just in limbo, waiting on publishers to put them out.
Right.
I think that's why some people decide to make the game themselves and put them out on crowdfunding platforms, but also like there's that security of like a publisher that knows what they're doing. They know how to do all the logistics. They know how to do all that stuff, but you got to get in line, you know.
You have to. There are other projects ahead of you. You have to, and you have to work into their schedule and what their release.
So I always find it, so many people that have played this game are like razzing me, like, I want my copy, I can't wait to play it. They're super excited, which is amazing. I'm like, imagine how long I've been waiting. I want a copy of the game too. I want to play it with more people. So
Sure. So let's. I want to ask about other hobbies and interests of yours. You seem you're a very active guy. Are there any other adventures and projects that you like to work on that are outside the world of gaming?
A lot of things that I do are tangentially within gaming. I do watch like anime and things like that, and I've gone to several anime conventions with my fiance Ruthie.
Okay.
So we have fun with that.
Do you do the cosplay thing?
We did, so I haven't really done it much before, but we went, the last anime convention we went to, we did Chainsaw Man characters a little bit, which is just like a white shirt and like a black tie or whatever. And instead of spiking my hair up, I had my hair down, you know.
What?
So, oh my goodness, no one recognized me. No one recognized me at anime conventions anyway. But it was fun, you know, just walking around, hanging out with different people and stuff like that. But yeah, I've always kind of had like watching anime and stuff like that in the background, but more recently I've been watching more and more stuff, so it's been pretty cool.
Very, very cool. So you are about to transition from a reviewer and sort of being steeped in that side of the hobby to having a released game where you will then be the reviewed individual. How are you mentally preparing yourself for that? To have people actually evaluate the final product that you've been working on?
I would be a lot more worried about it if I haven't had people like who've played the game and just having so much positive feedback over and over and over again. Like, honestly, because I work in board game media and because I'm already in the industry, if I didn't feel like the game was gonna do well, I would just not do it. You know, I don't need to make a game just to make a game.
Right.
You know, I want to make a game that serves a purpose, stands apart in the industry, and is something that people are actually going to get back to their table over and over again. So the fact that I've had so much positive feedback just from playtesting and from playing with random people with my prototypes and playing on Tabletop Simulator, and just the buzz I've had from other designers being like, I played it with Paul Denton, and he's like, I wish I had designed this. You know, that sort of feedback makes me think, well, hopefully it does good, you know?
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see. I'm sure I have had random critics, mostly of like the aesthetics of the game. You know, they're like, why does it have to be so gaudy, or why does it have to look so crazy? It's like, I like games that look really cool aesthetically. I want something that brings people into the table. I want something that's going to be an experience. I'm always about the theme and the experience in games. So, I mean, I'm sure I'll get criticisms in a bunch of different ways.
People saying, why aren't these planets discs? They really just should be flat.
Right, exactly. There'll be people that'll say that, and it'll be like, I could have saved a lot of money if I didn't have to buy these crazy 3D planets. But that's not the experience I want to bring to the table. Like, I listen to all these crazy podcasts and crazy things about space. I want to put people in that world, you know.
Did you bring any of those concepts from the space theory and stuff into Last Light? Is that?
I mean, I think a little bit.
An educational game?
It's definitely very science fantasy. You know,
Yeah.
It's science fantasy. It's crazy. It's wacky aliens and stuff. I mean, the premise of the heat death of the universe and all of the stars going dark and all these aliens trying to come to this one last star that's about to go black itself is pretty grim But then we have bright, colorful, lollipop-looking planets and like crazy-looking aliens that are all bright colored.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this weird like juxtaposition of like the crazy darkness of the actual theme behind it, and then the happy-go-lucky crazy aliens that are all at each other's throats. But yeah, I just the concept of trying to harvest light around like a dying star. There's a YouTube video from, I think it's like In a Nutshell, Quazat or something like that. They're like a German YouTuber or whatever. They made a video about white dwarf stars, and I got a lot of inspiration for the theme from that as well, about how humanity could be traveling to the last white dwarf stars and like trying to survive around the edge of those planets and things like that. And that made me think of all these crazy aliens kind of doing the same thing. So, it's an interesting theme. Just learning about that stuff kind of gave me the inspiration to try to be like, I want to make a game that's unique in that way, because there's tons of space games. There's not very many space games about all of the other stars going dark, which makes it interesting when you're designing and developing a game, because like the board is black with some like swirl designs on it.
Yeah.
It's a space game where the board is just mostly black, and people are like, well, why is it mostly black? Because there's no other stars.
There's no light, yeah.
There's no other stars. It's the last light, So it's kind of an interesting concept that people have to wrap their head around.
So when designers are making 4X style games, where you're exploring, exterminating, exploiting, and what's the last one? Expanding. It's often difficult to keep it to a manageable length. You mentioned all these games that you enjoyed playing that take forever to play. Why do you think that's often the trap that gets fallen into? It's always like this holy grail to come up with a 4X style game that is short.
Right.
Why is it so difficult, and how did you fight against that and make it work?
I think for most people, they're just trying to make a shorter game, like when they've tried to like approach a fast-playing 4X game before. And by shorter, they would just mean like the length of the game, which would make sense. I mean, I'm trying to make a shorter game, but you still have less actions when you do that sort of thing. It's like, okay, we're going to shorten the game. You're going to be able to win faster. So then the game's going to be over quicker. But then you're still taking turns around the board, and you're still taking kind of like just less actions in general. In Last Light, you're taking the same amount of actions, if not more actions, than you take in other 4X games like Twilight Imperium and Eclipse, because all those actions are simultaneous,
Right.
Because everybody is taking an action every single turn, and you're taking them at the same time. So like, if you're playing a 4-player game of Last Light for an hour, and you're playing that same kind of game of Twilight Imperium or Eclipse, that would be like 4 hours worth of gameplay than you get in that same hour. It's just packing the amount of actions you take really, really quick by doing these simultaneous actions. In Last Light, everybody picks an action card, they reveal it, and they execute those actions at the same time, and everything's kind of engineered from the ground up to not have conflicts in that. So a lot of other games, it's hard to do simultaneous actions because they didn't go into the game design. I mean, some games definitely do that. They go into the game design, you just have to make sure that there's no conflict. So that means you can't do certain things in design. Like you can't have an open market where people are picking a card out when you're doing things simultaneous. There's a lot of things you have to kind of like go away from when you're doing simultaneous actions, because there'll be conflict of action. So I've tried to do as many things to streamline that and make that work, and just make the game as intuitive as possible, so that just makes it easier for people to jump in and get in there. It's like, okay, this allows me to build stuff, this allows me to move stuff, this allows me to gain light, It's trying to make things simple for players to like have concepts that they see in other games, but still have like a different spin on all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, before we go, I want to, we are at a convention. We're at Dice Tower West. You must have played something this week. What's been your favorite game that's been either new to you or that you introduced to somebody?
There's a lot of new games that I really want to play that I haven't got to play
Haven't
yet.
gotten to
So
yet.
we're trying to get there. But I did play Project Elite. I taught that to several people. I taught it to Matthew, who's on the channel, and my fiance Ruthie, and we played with another gentleman.
Nice.
And we had a lot of fun with Project Elite. I love the fast-paced dice rolling and chucking. Also playing, speaking of space games, I played Alien Frontiers.
Yes.
Which is like a game that kind of started off the Kickstarter craze,
did.
and it's just a solid dice placement game. It was just a lot of fun, and I taught that to Ruthie as well, and it was a lot of fun, like playing through all that stuff. So
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to pick a favorite. There's been getting to play. There's always more games you want to get played than there's time to do so. That's always the struggle at these sorts of things. But I did get to play Earth.
that's like at one of the top of my list for things that I want to play.
You haven't played it yet.
I haven't played it yet.
I mean, just lovely tableau building, cool adjacency rules. It's intuitive. There's only 4 actions. And so the actual play of the game is pretty easy to figure out.
That's
but
awesome.
then it's how it all interacts and how you build your stuff and what the scoring goals are. I can see how I think it's going to be a
hit,
solid
sure,
one that people are looking to play. So that's been my highlight of the week so far.
That's awesome.
Well, Roy, thank you so much for one, being flexible with our wacky plan, but it is you are someone I've always wanted to talk to about your unique experience as you're about to be the published designer. You're going to be showing off your game at Gen Con and all that fun stuff. I'm very excited for the rest of this year for you, and I appreciate you coming by.
Thanks so much, man. I know I get to work with you a ton on all the Dice Tower stuff, and it's always a pleasure when we actually get to see each other, because we work at the same place a lot of times, but we're always very distant, so it's kind of cool to be able to do stuff together.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time at the table.
Future Eric here to say thank you for joining us today. We'll see you again in 2 weeks when our guest will be Anne-Marie DeWitt. At the Table is produced by Tom and me with assistance from Roy Cannaday, Wendy Yee, and Chris Yee. What Conan said upon descending to the Aquilonian throne is brought to you by The Last Kingdom. Our theme is written by Timothy Pinkham, arranged by Dave Culling, and support for everything at the Dice Tower comes from viewers and listeners like you. Reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter, or to tom@dicetower.com or eric@dicetower.com. Until we see you again, from all of us at the table, have fun gaming.